So thank all of you for being here. Turn, if you will, to Psalm 127, and then we'll segue from that to some passages in Proverbs that I want to mention. As you're turning there, let me just say, and I'm going to give you all a chance to comment on this, that parenting is one of the great opportunities of life. And I know sometimes whether you're on the receiving or giving end of that, you're not sure about that, but that is the case. I'm going to ask you later if you think parenting is easy, and I want those who are unmarried to comment about whether you think, or those who don't have children, I'll put it that way, whether you think parenting is or was easy, and then want some of the parents, and that's going to give Derek an opportunity to redeem himself today. Psalm 127, you're familiar with that, I hope. Beginning in verse 3, he says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's one's youth." I'll get it out in a minute. "So the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gates." And then, as you'll see on your handout, I put a couple of passages there out of Proverbs to, these are kind of supporting passages. The one for the mothers is found in 31:28, and I would assume most of you are familiar with that. That's what's been called the worthy woman. Verse 28 says, "Her children rise up and call her blessed, and her husband also, and he praises her." Now, I also have a psalm in there for the men, for the fathers, not the men, but for the fathers, in Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 7. Proverbs 20 and 7. "The righteous man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him." And then the refrain on that one is in 23 and 24. 23 and 24 says, "The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, but he who begets a wise child will delight in him." So those of you who are parents, take those verses and think about those, and it's a compliment to parents who carry out their responsibilities the way God would have them to do. Several years ago, so long ago it was at 12th Street, and I don't remember who it was. Somebody was holding a meeting for us, and he posed a question that still rings in my ears. He said, "How would you like to have been the parents of Jesus?" And I thought about that, and I thought, oh my, I don't think I would have liked that role. I don't think Jesus would have turned out like he did. I really don't think that, but because I think God was in control. But can you imagine being the parents of Jesus? Does that ring any bell with anybody? How do you think you'd like to have been the parent of Jesus? Because you remember the angel that talked, they knew something about what was going on. And I just thought it's a pretty astounding sort of thing. Well, you're not the parent of Jesus, but you are the parent if you have children or a child. You're the parent of a child from God. And that's a pretty heavy responsibility, I think. Think about, and some of you have been in this predicament, some of you have been in this situation a number of times. Think about what happens when a child is expected, whether it's by birth or by adoption. What happens? What happens in a family when and particularly if it's the first child? What kinds of things happen in the household? What do you do? You all never been there? You're what? You're excited. What else do you do?
Lots of preparation.
Lots of preparation. Yeah. You got to decide what? Whether the room's going to be pink or blue. I did think, probably shouldn't say this, but I will anyway. I did think in this day and age, with some society, I guess it will be striped. One stripe will be pink and one will be blue. If you don't get that, I'll explain it to you after class. What else happens in families when a child is being expected?
Lots of advice is handed down.
Okay. And not only is a lot going on with the parents, but there's probably, in some cases, if it's the first child, who else is all excited about that?
The grandparents.
The
are
grandparents.
giving the advice.
I was at a meeting today, and the person who said this, I don't know a lot about his family. He had a hoary head, and he was all excited because they're expecting at this point in his life their first grandchild, and he was just carried away with this. Well, there's a thought behind all this. We make all of these preparations. Do we prepare as much spiritually as we do otherwise? And we all have to answer that individually, not collectively. You can comment if you want to about it. But it occurred to me today in thinking about this, that we go through all of these things and we tell everybody, oh, our daughter, our son, his wife, our daughter and her husband are having a child. And it's going to be a hippo or whatever you know it's going to be. And you know, they just spread the word. I'm not persuaded, though, that we do that much preparation as far as spirituality is concerned. And once the child gets here, you know, we get them things that symbolically has a spiritual application. And I don't want to wear this point out, but I think we prepare more for the physical side of things than we do with the other. So, congratulations to those of you who are parents. Question. Is it easy being a parent? No. Derek?
No, it's not.
Well, do you want to comment?
No.
For those who weren't here, Derek made a comment in class Sunday about children, and he told me later he thought maybe people didn't understand it, so I thought I'd give him a chance to explain it.
I feel like you've lost sleep over it.
Oh, I have. You may have, but I haven't. So, does everyone think parenting is difficult? Does anyone think parenting is easy? For those of you who are younger and it hasn't been too long since you were home, do you think it was easy for your parents? Or you're not going to speak? There's several. It wasn't easy for your parents?
No, probably not.
Why do you think it's not? You don't have if you all had been here tonight, he would have probably spoken on that. Well, I did read, somebody had written that anything that begins with labor can't be easy. And only the women can understand that. So then, if it's difficult, if it's trying, if it's costly, why do we do that? Why do we have children?
That was part of God's plan for the family.
Part of God's to replenish the earth. Why else? Gives you something to do. No.
Somebody take care of me when I can't walk.
Okay, and there's a passage about that, right? And we'll make it to that tonight. That when you're old, Paul wrote to Timothy about that. So that children and grandchildren would requite, in the old King James, care for them. Well, I would assume that we do that for a lot of reasons, but some of those is because God requires that, and it gives us an opportunity to glorify God through the children that we produce and the children we raise. And I would agree that raising children has on occasion been difficult. But there are things that come out of that are very worthwhile in the long run. So tonight we're going to talk about, I'm not going to tell you how to raise your children, but I am going to talk some about passages that relate to parenting. And I guess this would be more motivational than informational for those who maybe haven't been around a long time. And I was going to ask Richard about this, and he's not here. For a good long time, we have been doing a class from time to time called Raising Kids God's Way. And I've taught that at least once. That's the title of a book. There are things like all uninspired writings that I don't agree with in that book. But the class is, in fact, sometime recently, did Richard and Charity have that at their house? Or was it here? It was here, okay. So that was offered when? Last trimester? Okay. So that deals more with the how-to as far as raising children are concerned. And I want to try to do things that I hope will be more motivational as far as serving as a parent now or serving as a parent sometime in your future. I think the goal of this should be the glorification of God, and through the development of your children both spiritually and physically and emotionally and socially, you can do a world of good as far as this world is concerned. Some challenges, since we've talked about that. There are some challenges that come depending on the age. And I'll tell you what mine is. Our children are well past middle age, so it's been a long time, but I still remember. So what do you think, and this is a serious question now, for the parents, what do you think is the most difficult thing about parenting?
Consistency.
Consistency. You mean between and among children, or between
In myself,
on your part?
being a parent,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I think every kid is, for us, different, so they respond differently to how you teach them or train them or whatever.
Okay. So the difficulty there is you're being able to adjust to the child. Okay.
Many times, this relates with what Eric said, but not necessarily consistency, but how constant sometimes it is. Well, it is always constant, you know.
Yeah. Okay. What else?
Well, I think as they get older, it gets harder to allow them to have more responsibility. And like Reese drove to school today for the first time, and
Yeah.
you know, I happened to go by school later and make sure he parked right, you know. So I'm not that way usually, but it's kind of a big deal that he's driving his brother to school.
And this is something I was going to deal with later, but let me just deal with it right now. And what Brother Conley has said is, what's the word you used? What I was going to use was transferring responsibility. For those of you who've been in the Raising Kids God's Way class, I think there's a chart in that book. And what happens when a child is small and firstborn and small, who's totally making the decisions? The parents are, and the parents need to. Well, as time goes along, you want this child to learn how to handle things and handle situations, so you begin to transfer a little bit of that responsibility to the child. And depending on the child, when they get about age 12, 13, somewhere in there, you're almost a balance between the decisions you're making for the child and the child's involvement in that. And then at some point, somebody said 18, nobody knows. At some point in time, probably when they leave home, you're out of that picture. Not that you don't have association with them, but you're no longer telling them when to get up and when to go to bed and all those kinds of things. But hopefully you have trained them well while they're under your roof, so that then they're able to take over that responsibility. And that gets to be a little bit of an anxious time. You wonder if he parked right at school, and you know, a whole lot of things there that come about. So what you do early in life leads to that point. What are any other challenges that you all would want to share about what you do? What challenges you've had with discipline?
I think worrying in the moment, am I handling this the right way?
Worrying at the moment about handling this correctly. Well, I would agree. Well, I told you, I'd tell you, as our children got older, and I don't know where this came about, but at some point, I think the biggest concern I had was watching them fail. And at some time, you need to let your kids, when they get to some point, you need to let them fail, because they have to learn how to fail. And you know, you want to make sure they park right, or whatever it is. You know, at some point, it's difficult to turn loose and just let them learn on their own. And for me, in looking back, not when they were terrible twos, but later on in life, that was one of the hardest things for me to do. And both of them ended up going to school where I was working, and our son's name is Paul Kelly, but we always called him Kelly. And back in those days, Western would run out an IBM sheet for everybody, and he always hated for it to come out because it would have his first name on it. And if your dad's working on campus with that same name, then he'd say, you know, I just hated that. So I understand that. He doesn't mind it anymore now that he's a lot older. But point about that is your children also have some views about that, because they get to a point where they don't want to be totally under your wing. They want to be under your wing when they need money, or they want a new car, or a car, or several other things. But you know, it's just that transition, that sharing of responsibility that has to come about. Anything else on that? Well, I need to move on. So it is difficult, but it's the thing that God gave us to do. And just remember, in Proverbs 19:18, it says, discipline your son, for in that there is hope. There's hope in discipline. Do not be a willing partner to his death, one translation says. The other translation says to his destruction. In other words, discipline him, and remember that improvement will try to improve him while there's still hope. Okay, number 3 on the outline, I'm going through this pretty quickly, about functions of praying. One of the functions of parenting, and we had read from Psalms 127, we bring a child into the world, we start a soul toward eternity. And again, to make you think seriously about this, if you haven't had a child, or if you have, think seriously about this. When you have a child, you're bringing a soul into this world, and that soul is going to have an eternity. And there are one of 2 choices. So that puts a little bit of a burden on those of us who are parents. I'll come back to another point or 2 in a moment. But some other things in number 3, turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6, if you will. Now I want to spend a little time on this. Some of you will be familiar with Deuteronomy chapter 6. While you're turning there, remember that Moses wrote Deuteronomy because it was after they had were getting ready to go into the promised land. And remember that those who were going into the promised land, when they were in the wilderness, they were what age and below? What? 40. No, they were 20, because you remember all those who were over 20, what happened to them? They died in the wilderness. So in Exodus, if you do Exodus 30, 34, all through there, that's where the 10 Commandments was given, but those were the older people. So we get to going into the promised land, And these are people who had been at an earlier age, and they hadn't known the law that was given, like it had been given to their parents and grandparents and other people. So then he writes, he tells them, beginning in verse 4, and I had not noticed this until I read it yesterday. Have you noticed how many verbs there are in this reading? Beginning in verse 4 of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Here's what he tells them to do. You shall love, that's a verb, the Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. Now beginning in verse 7. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And turn over quick over to 32, chapter 32 and verse 46. And there's kind of a sequel there. 32 and 46. Beginning in 45, Moses finished speaking all these words to all Israel, and he said to them, set your hearts on all the words which I testify among you today, which you shall command your children to be careful to observe all the words of this law. That same point is made in several other ways in the scriptures. You remember when they crossed the Jordan, they put the stones up, and they said, what's this for? And he said, what? I'm sorry? When you pass by, tell your children. Other occasions they've said, what's this for? And he said, when your children ask you, in other words, this will be a reminder to them. So there are a lot of passages in the New Testament with regard to teaching your children, but it seems to me what he says to them here in Deuteronomy is so impactful. And it's what the Jewish people call this the Shema, verses 4 through 9, I think it is there. If that was good for people in those days, it's good for people in every day, in every age. So one of the things that as parents we need to do is teach our children the Word of God. You all want to comment anything about that? Well, let me see. Then the next thing that I mentioned on there is about prayer. Our lesson last time was on spiritual intimacy, and we talked about that. In Judges chapter 13, we won't go there, but in Judges 13, the parents of Samson prayed to God, and they said, teach us what we shall do for the child who will be ours. You know, when you're carrying a child, the family should be praying, grandparents should be praying that this child will, we're very faithful, I think, about praying that the child will be healthy and they'll have a good delivery, and that's fine, that's what we should do. But we also ought to think about how that child's going to be raised and how it's going to touch the life of other people. Prayer we talked about last times. I would mention one other couple. You remember in the first chapter of Luke, we have there about Elizabeth and Zacharias, who were the parents rather of John the Baptist. And there's not a particular prayer mentioned there, but it tells about how they are. It said they were found blameless before God, and spiritual kinds of things. If you go back and read in that first chapter, there are a lot of things that are said there about how they did their lives. You know, finally Zacharias was muted till he was unmuted to tell what the name of the child would be. But it's a godly kind of approach to life, I guess is what I want to say about that. The next thing on that outline is teaching. I already mentioned a good bit about that. In Isaiah 54:3, it says that their children should be taught by the Lord. Now, the only way that the Lord can teach them right then would be through His Word. And then I was going to read Psalm 78, 1 through 6, but you all can do that on your own if you're interested. And then parents should nurture physically, spiritually, mentally, and socially their children. And I'm reminded of Luke 2:52, where it has to do with Jesus as he was getting a little older. Or some people think he was about 12 years of age. Nobody knows for sure. But it says that he grew in 3 ways. What were those? if I remember.
Stature.
I'm sorry?
Stature.
Stature, wisdom, and favor with God and man. Well, I mentioned earlier about being the parents of Jesus. Maybe the parents were pretty good. Maybe they're pretty effective with him. And if that was good for Jesus, that would be good with a lot of other people. Then spend just a little bit of time talking about discipline. Now, when you hear the word discipline, what do you think about? What comes to your mind?
Spanking.
Spanking. Yep. I would tell you that. I haven't told you all this story. When I was a little kid, if there would have had all these initials now about what's wrong with children, I would have probably had most of those. And I certainly would have been hyperactive. And my mother, as I told you all the first class I taught, up until I married, the greatest influence in my life was my mother. I think some days I averaged 3 spankings a day. And maybe that's an average. Sometimes I think it was more than that. And that doesn't include those that she did not do. And of course she would whip me and say, you know, this hurts me more than you. Right at that time I thought, I'll never say that to my kids. And I didn't. I knew what she had in mind, but I also knew how it hurt. When she said it hurts me more than you, I was thinking, no, you're administering, I'm receiving. But anyway, my point about all that is discipline is more than punishment. Punishment is a part of that. The discipline process is a process of teaching, of training, of enforcing, such as teaching children how to be responsible. That's one of the reasons we have chores. And another reason to do chores is because you don't want to do them yourself. It's teaching children to be mannerly, to be respectful, to be caring, to be sharing, and one I will talk about just a little bit, being under authority. And come back to that in just a moment. But we do all those things because that's how a child learns how to be an adult. And these are things that should characterize Christians. Children, and they're going about learning about authority, and that's one of my lists on here in Ephesians 6, but I'm not going to get there, I don't think. But authority, understanding about authority is really important. And to just say, in our culture now, it's my opinion that we have lost a great deal about respect for authority. And after all, the scriptures deal with that. You know, we're to obey the government. And people say, yeah, but they don't know how the government was. Well, when Paul wrote that, he was in Rome. And Rome had about as ungodly a government as anybody has ever had. So it's the government, and God tells in the scriptures why you're to abide by the government, because they regulate and do various other things. So we need to be able to raise our children to the point of functioning well in society and culture, and that's how Christians ought to obey themselves. Submission is a part of that. Let's see, Scott did his lesson on submission already, right? I think he did. Yes, he did. But he was directing it otherwise. All of us submit to someone. And those who come out of homes where they don't learn about orderliness and submission and that sort of thing, fight against the windmills, as the expression is used. And they need to be taught that, and it needs to be set as an example for them. And I would suggest to you that if there's a struggle of wills between a parent and a child, the parent should always win, because the children are learning. Now, you may disagree with that, and you can raise your kid however you want to, but that's my opinion about that. And even if it's at the time of the terrible twos, in fact, that may be the best time to teach submission, if you can survive it. Just some principles. And this is, if you turn your sheet over on the back side, since I'm not going to get there, This is out of, what still is the source, Keeping Your Family Together When the World is Falling Apart. 3 questions to parents regarding making children mine. How do I love my children? Do you have a conflict when you are having to discipline your child and think on the one hand, well, I hate to have to do this, but on the other hand, I love them? Do any of you, is that a conflict for you? You don't have to answer. How do I respect my child? How do I hold my children accountable? And then this Kevin Lehman talked about reality and discipline. It says the whole is always more important than the parts, the bigger picture. Have values and live by them. That is especially important. Somebody else I read about described it this way, that you should have fences. In other words, when you say, okay, here's what you can do and what you cannot do, the guides you have, he described those as fences. And he says, never move your fence. Once you have said to your children, here's what it is, and they buck against it, don't change. Some of those things are easier said than done. Always put your spouse, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, always put your spouse, not your children, first. I think it is really important about that. And again, you may not accept this, you don't have to. Here's the reason I think that it's important that the spouse gets put ahead of the children. The children need to learn that they are not the center of everything. And that the parents are older, their parents are a whole lot of things the children are not. Now, that's not to say that you neglect your children, but in the order of things, I think the parents should take precedence over the children. And that's all I'll say about that. I think that's a really important point here. And then balance responsibility with forgiveness and love. Stick to your guns. I've already talked about that a little bit. Keep the responsibility where it belongs. The responsibility for being a parent belongs with the parent. The responsibility of being a child belongs with the child. And you're the one that's the administrator, so they need to take care of it. Treat children like people and not things. Easy to say. So, I guess I'll leave with that. The other thing I have on this sheet, and going back to the front page, is love your children. And somebody might say, well, sure, you love your children. I know that nobody in here has experienced this. Sometimes, like adults, children are easier to love sometimes than other times. And sometimes it's, you kind of have to grit your teeth and go through that. But remember, they have a reaction to how their parents are. On needs of parents, and I think in the household, this is a really important thing. You can see those. Parents need each other. They need obedience from the children. They need honor and respect from the children, the courtesies of the children. Need some of the children's time. Need love from the children, just like you need to love your children. You need love from them. And then, as Tim mentioned a minute ago, personal care in latter times, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 4, he wrote about that. And of course, at this age in life, I'm all for that. That's probably the best thing on here. Then children have needs. A stable home. And in our culture today, and I am so thankful to be in a room with a group of people like you, because if you take this group and put you out in our community, you're going to stand out. For those of you who teach and have taught, you know what's going on in a lot of our culture. So a stable home is really essential. Children need love from their parents. They need instruction. They need proper example. And in that regard, think about what legacy you're going to leave for your children. And everybody, all parents, whether you want to think of that or not, you're leaving a legacy. And hopefully it's the right one. Children need discipline, a measure of freedom. Scott, that's what we were talking about earlier, and that's a really tricky one. I mean, it's not when they're 4 years old, but you know, as kids begin to mature, that's a tricky kind of one. A recognition of their achievements, and they need to be given responsibility. And it's easy to say that, but I think they do. We've got about 3 minutes. I want to do one other thing, but I want to see if you all have something you want to say or comments about anything. I'll put you all to sleep. Down at the bottom of this the sheet on the back, you might not expect to find this on this, is self-esteem. And self-esteem needs to be put in the right kind of context. But I think Christians sometimes, and children, need a dose of things about this. We sometimes, I think, look at self-esteem, you know, we look at an athlete who can run 100 miles an hour or whatever it might be, and that, to me, is not part of self-esteem. Self-esteem is because we're children of God. And there are several, turn to Romans chapter 8, if you will. Romans chapter 8. And verse 31. This is a passage what I'd be familiar with. Romans 8:31. What then can we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? And one of the things that we need to think about, that God is with us, and we should feel, and I'm going to use it this way, it's probably not the best way, we should feel good about ourselves, not because we're good looking, some of us don't have a problem with that, not because a whole lot of other things, but it's because we're children of God. And you're raising children of God. And the reason I put this in here, there are a lot of college students. You know, they leave home, they've been in a little bit of a sheltered situation, some more than others. And you get on a college campus, and they really feel beaten down, depending on where they are, the size of the school, a whole bunch of things. But it's because their confidence was a false confidence, because it came from the best looking, the most popular, the most talented, the most whatever, when it should be coming from the Word of God. And that's what all these passages are on here for, and it cites on you where they came from. And I would just suggest you give attention to those. If you're dealing with a child that is old enough to be able to understand some of these things, and you know, nobody likes me, I have no friends, all these things that we get, nobody sits with me at lunch, all those kinds of things that you deal with growing up. These are some passages that, and there are people who are 45 and 50 years old who deal with some of these same kinds of things. But this is what's important as far as your self-image, and not the best clothes and all that, the busy, fastest car and what have you. So, this bell should ring. What else? What do you want to say? Tim?
We just had a retreat for teens, college students on the weekend. It was all about social media.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a huge thing for parents to be aware of what's going on with social media.
Yeah. Anybody else? Well, I don't know where the bell ringer is. What's that? Check the Facebook. I thank all of you for being good parents And some days, parents just think, how in the world did I get in this kind of situation? How in the world? Thank you all.